The criminal exchange under the Nazi overthrow of the United States, amongst other subversions and subcultures in the fiefdom arrangements under the feudal structure of the Confederacy and their wizard arrangements, generating the exponential position of the order that the militia, loyal to the Confederacy, in its overthrow of the United States, should not be restrained, and thus perpetually abusing the general public is a function of the Confederacy. Traumatizing the general public as to be subjugating them includes the genocidal maniac's position for Will Irwin's character from the court, which had the acknowledged position to say that if you destroy or arrest or murder 30% of the population and then you can divide it amongst the rest of them, then the overarching structures of the larger groups would have their political agenda without the restraints, and thus the 30% divided amongst the rest of them in the socialist arrangement for his communist argument qualifies their ability to receive the local payment of the divided resources for the service to the larger goal, which is the unrestrained mechanism of their magic system, at which point the magic system qualifies its primary opposition, which is the patriarchy, and the patriarchy is David's character, and David's character being attacked by them was one of their primary functions from the very beginning, at which point the idea is that the erosion of his person should affect the title, which is not legal in the United States. The argument is that the generic erosion is like a mountain. Can you erode a mountain into being taller? I think was the quote. And there's all kinds of things, and there was another character that came in, and his argument was that if there's a major tectonic plate, then you can raise it exponentially, which is true functionally, but the argument is designed to specifically ignore the American obligation that of capitalism, which is the non-obstruction of titles, the non-obstruction of contracts, the non-obstruction of associations, which is their primary strategy in their dark psychology insurrection, at which point the erosion that they're referring to is David, as convicted by the Confederates as general over the United States, as the preferred general. The bureaucrats' jealousy engaged in the retaliation is the larger overarching issue, which generates the profits for the locals, who are destroying the 30% of their population in order to divide the resources for their collectivist insanity, which, again, the thing is the same as with insurgency. It divides infinitely. First it's 30, and then it's 30, and then it's 30, and then, you continue on until there's only your most core group. You divide all other political identities, you divide all other major aspects of the general society, and then you only have your core group, which tells you, functionally, that the locals versus the larger exponential position are in that arrangement for sacrifice. Now, they may or may not be competent enough to understand that they'll be used against themselves towards the system, which would have been finalized by the time it would have gotten to them, at which point, similar to the Soviet Union and many of the soldiers who engaged in these same atrocities, such as in the Gulag Archipelago, would just accept their fate functionally in the position because I guess they had a good run, and there aren't real laws involved, there aren't real violations involved. It's just, you got the short stick, you you rolled bad. Functionally, since there is no argument, they just have to accept their fate like everyone else. They would have told everyone else, just accept your fate, exponentially until it gets to them, and then there's nothing to do about it. At which point, their Satanist system is foundationally and holistically evil, just like the rest of it. At which point, you have all of their advantages. Now, their character, mentioned before, would have stalked David's character since he was born, at which point the active use of the surveillance for the abuse is based upon the strategic advantages, at which point the addiction of abusing other people for the false sense of control is similar to people who are, generically abusive in their romantic relationships or abusive to animals and other things like this, which is basically what their argument is. Through the function of the target for the strategic overthrow of the system, you have the mechanism of dehumanizing them into a slave mechanism, at which point the concept of stalking and abusing and harassing and being malicious in every form, it would be normal and ordinary to them, at which point you have the normal abusive twatish behaviors. But ultimately, in the development of that system, you're inevitably going to find that there is an end to when it is enjoyable, and when you have an end to that, you have to start becoming extremely practical towards the larger Nazi organization, at which point, as was discovered in the characters, they remove the personality, at which point, the dark psychology of the least amount of good in order to engage in the most amount of evil dictates the exponential isolations of various targets in order to develop that dark psychology in its functional advantages, at which point the inevitability of the removing of the person into the collective psychopathy is actively an ultimate reality that was unavoidable from the very beginning and is normal to their culture. Now, their trades with many of the pastors to infiltrate the church and to overthrow it and to invert it from Christianity into Satanism has actively been conducted and is actively viable. Many of them are engaged in that activity in order to oversee the systematic processing for the eventual genocide and redistribution for the collectivist agenda into the position of addiction for the pursuit of wealth. Now, if you murder your neighbors in order to ingest their wealth, you still have the basic human desire for the acquiring of more, at which point you're always going to want to use that mechanism more and more and more and more, similar to people's encouragement in capitalism towards the development of working harder to get more stuff, except the working harder is murdering people in your society for the larger insurgency overthrowing that society, at which point the capturing of key locations, such as the pastors, such as the police, in order to subvert law enforcement, in order to subvert social stability of community systems and organizations. You have the persistent application of their Druid oversight for these procedures to the Satanist end, which is the perpetual state of evil day and night, through their wizard mechanism, which is the functional biblical version of sorcery, which is the control over mind, which is it's called pharmakia. It means to control one's mind. The drugs and secret techniques in order to engage in the mind control or human trafficking control or surveillance, subversions, has been a historic position, only secret. Now, these advantages have been condemned in the Bible because they're real. And if they were fake, then they wouldn't get mentioned. But they are actual functional positions, and they are things that are historically viable throughout all of the societies which have actively categorized inside their literature, qualifying society's tendency towards these extreme evil societies, which are the exponential anti-human societies, which cannot be tolerated to exist, as the complete subversion of any reason to have had a human society. The complete destruction of society will inevitably conclude to the maximum evil, which would ultimately lead to the Sodom and Gomorrah arrangement, where God eventually has to kill them. Now, this is specific to their interest as people seeking to summon God so that they can try and murder him with their inferior technology, which they had actively engaged in the trap. Many of the pastors think that they're laying for the Satanists is the strategic restraints against the development of the correct technologies. So people that were projected to develop technology, such as David's character, and many of the others targeted by their, what do you call it? But don't really have any of the positives of either side. And so they're actively just sentencing themselves to hell for no reason, at which point they're off in their own la-la land, or whatever it is that they would have strategically designed for themselves. But the functional position of their oversight mechanisms qualifies the oppressive surveillance system for their phantom cells in order to strategically engage in the dismantlement of society, which doesn't seem to have a function as the phantom cell unless you look at it at its broader mechanism. When you look at it at the broader screen, you see how all of these subtle little things would develop into a larger functional plan, at which point you have lots of tendencies towards the use of abuse and trafficking in order to acquire the specific strategic agendas, at which point they could take someone to a completely new place in order to acquire something that they wanted to understand until they see it, at which point it's just going to a place and it's just going through the cycle, going through the rhythm, at which point they'll have some kind of cover story, and then the thing that's there is supposed to develop, and then, you know, they'll meet someone or they'll see something, and it will develop as normal, and that thing that they're supposed to go there in order to experience is supposed to engage in that collaboration with the larger scheme. So if we observe the world at large, the things that don't seem to have an interconnected position, they seem arbitrary and disconnected and irrelevant, are actively being manipulated by the psychopath society seeking the overthrow of the United States and the West and the world, and ultimately the attempt to murder God, at which point you can't take anything for granted that it seems off, because it is off. It's put there on purpose for the development of the larger mechanism for the application of the criminal scheme, at which point your pursuits, if you're engaged in any kind of investigation or soul searching or any of these, you have to look at the larger damages in order to understand the inferior actions implications. At which point, when you see the larger things, such as the food crises and the money crises and the energy crises and the wars and all of the rest of it, You have to understand each and every part of this was manufactured from scratch in order to make and prevent all of the right things for it to work specifically in order. So those that are chaotically unaligned with the mechanism would be functionally Ponzi's or patsies into the larger scheme, at which point they're aiding and abetting through the strategy of gross negligence allows for the development of the scheme to get legs and move to maturity. Which means, by definition, if you're to be innocent in the affair, you have to engage in the correct due diligence and investigation. At which point, their pursuit of better knowledge qualifies their ability to see the larger schemes and deconstruct the functional replacement of the American system with the Confederate system amongst all of the other international affairs which might have their own subgroups and fiefdoms orchestrating their larger mechanism, at which point the reverse engineering of the system is necessary in order to find the legal position, at which point they're going to distract you with whatever it is they can, like it's too difficult or it's too subversive or there isn't enough of X, Y, or Z in order to proceed to the other things, at which point the position is just the collection of where you have and just continuing on, such as the development of faith by works from the Bible, at which point I think it was James, it says, show me your faith without works and I'll show you my faith by works. Faith without works is dead, at which point you understand the development of the thing. It's just the collection and steady application of the development towards the positive investigation against their criminal subversions of the greater society, which ultimately, if successful, could stop the mass murdering genocides, which will only start fundamentally at the 30%.